A millionaire hires a single father as a party escort, but her son makes a request that leaves her shocked. The first thing you noticed about James Calloway was his hands, not his face, not his posture, not the black tuxedo he had rented for $48 from a shop on Meridian Street, where the owner didn't ask questions and the suit smelled faintly of other men's occasions. No, it was his hands. Wide, calloused, with knuckles that had known cold mornings and heavy loads and years of work that nobody ever photographed or praised. Hands that told the whole story of a man before he opened his mouth. Hands that belonged in a garage or on a construction scaffold, not inside the gilded foyer of the Harland estate on a Tuesday evening in October. He stood at the base of the marble staircase and held his spine straight. That was the only thing he allowed himself. One small dignity, his back perfectly straight. "You're late," said the woman at the top of the stairs. Her voice arrived before she did. Clear, precise, carrying the particular edge of someone who had never once been told to wait. Then she descended, and James understood, in the way that men who have lived hard lives understand things quickly, that Sophia Harland was not a woman who moved through the world. The world rearranged itself around her. She was 30 years old and looked like a painting that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be admired or feared. The dress was blue, not the shy blue of a clear sky, but a deep, sovereign blue, the kind that made the gold in the chandelier above seem to lean toward her. Royal blue, people would call it later, and the name was accurate. Her heels clicked against each marble step with the rhythm of someone who had climbed and descended staircases like this one since she was old enough to walk without holding the railing. Her blonde hair was swept up, precise and uncompromising. Her earrings caught the light. She reached the bottom step and looked at James the way a person looks at a chair they're not sure is sturdy enough to sit in. "You're also underdressed." James said nothing. He had been told to wear a tuxedo. He was wearing a tuxedo. The fact that it had been rented and hers had been tailored was a distinction she could observe, and he could not change, so he chose not to acknowledge it. "Mrs. Harland," he said instead. "Miss," she corrected. "And you are James." Not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite disdain, something in between that wealthy people sometimes wear when they're deciding how much to acknowledge another person's humanity. She turned before he could read it fully and began walking toward a set of double doors at the far end of the foyer. "Tonight is a dinner hosted by the Whitmore family. You will stand near me, you will not volunteer opinions, and you will not embarrass me." She paused at the doors and glanced back over her shoulder. "Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am," James said again. The doors opened. The noise of 100 people who had never worked with their hands washed over him like warm, perfumed water. He had taken the job because of Noah. That was the beginning and the end of every decision James Calloway made. Before he said yes or no to anything, a shift, an expense, a risk, a sacrifice, he ran it through the same simple filter. What does this mean for Noah? The job had paid well. Better than the loading dock. Better than the 2 nights a week he spent driving for a car service, ferrying people like the ones in this room from one lit-up building to another, listening to their conversations about investment portfolios and vacation properties while he calculated whether he could afford new sneakers for his son before the school year started. The agency had found him. Or rather, someone at the agency had seen his photograph, taken 3 years ago for a charity auction event where he'd volunteered as a server, and passed it along to a coordinator who handled what they called social companionship for clients who needed a presentable male presence at formal events without the complications of an actual relationship. It was not the kind of work a man like James Calloway had ever imagined himself doing. But it was legal, it was clean, and on a good month it covered the difference between managing and drowning. So he wore the rented tuxedo, and he kept his back straight, and he stood near Sophia Harland in a room full of people who looked through him like glass. That was the other thing he had learned quickly. To the people in these rooms, he was furniture. Expensive-looking furniture that Sophia had chosen for the evening, but furniture nonetheless. The men shook his hand with the grip of people who had already categorized him, and found the category uninteresting. The women spoke to Sophia about him as though he weren't standing 18 inches away. "New one?" said a woman named Patricia Whitmore, whose jewelry alone could have paid Noah's school tuition for a decade. "Temporary," Sophia said. Patricia's eyes moved across James with the disinterest of a customs agent examining luggage. Acceptable, I suppose." James looked at the painting on the wall behind Patricia's head. It was an abstract piece in shades of gray and burgundy. He focused on it the way a man focuses on a fixed point when the ground is moving. Steadily, without expression, without surrender. Acceptable, I suppose. He had been a Marine. He had served 2 tours in places whose names people in this room probably couldn't locate on a map. He had carried men heavier than himself through conditions that would have broken most of the polished, comfortable people standing in this chandelier-lit room eating canapés and discussing their second homes. He had buried a friend at 26 and come home to a country that thanked him with a handshake and a form letter. He had raised a son alone since the boy was 4 months old, working doubles and triples and overnight shifts, and never, not once, asking anyone to feel sorry for him. Acceptable, I suppose. The painting was gray and burgundy. He kept his eyes on it. His back remained straight. Across the room, a man named Gerald Whitmore, 55, red-faced, the kind of loud that money makes possible, was holding court near the bar. He was telling a story that required him to gesture widely with his Scotch glass. And the people around him were laughing at the intervals he left for them to laugh. James had seen men like Gerald Whitmore in every city he'd ever been in. The uniform changed. Sometimes it was a suit, sometimes it was a golf shirt, sometimes it was a contractor's jacket with a logo embroidered on the chest. But the essential nature was the same. A man who had confused being loud with being strong. A man who had never once in his life been humbled by anything larger than himself, and who had therefore never grown past the size of his own comfort. Gerald noticed James the way those men always notice someone who doesn't belong, with the instinct of a dog that has smelled something it wants to chase. He crossed the room with his Scotch. "You're the Harlan woman's +1?" he said. Not to James's face. To the general vicinity of James, as though addressing him directly would grant him too much status. "I'm accompanying Miss Harlan this evening, yes," James said. Gerald looked at him then. A slow, deliberate look. "What do you do?" "For work. Real work." The people nearby had grown quiet in the particular way that crowds grow quiet when they sense the possibility of blood. "I work in logistics," James said. It was true. The loading dock was logistics. "Logistics!" Gerald repeated the word with the tone of someone who had just been told a joke they didn't find funny. "Right." He glanced at the people around him, and they gave him the small smiles that his type requires for fuel. "Well, at least you clean up well." Laughter. Not from everyone, but from enough. James did not move, did not shift his weight, did not clench his jaw or his fists or change a single thing about the expression on his face. He had learned, a long time ago in places far more dangerous than this dining room, that the man who reacts loses. That stillness is its own kind of power. That there is a version of dignity that cannot be touched by small men with large bank accounts and the social permission to be cruel. He looked at Gerald Whitmore calmly. "Thank you," he said. Just that. 2 words, and something in the quietness of them made Gerald blink, just once, just briefly, before he turned back to his audience and resumed his story. Sophia had watched the exchange from 8 feet away. James did not look at her. He returned his gaze to the painting. Gray and burgundy, fixed and still. Later, in the car on the way back to the estate, she sat on the far side of the back seat, with her arms crossed and her eyes on the window, and for a long time, neither of them said anything. Then, "You didn't react." "No," he said. "Most men would have. Most men haven't had much practice." She turned from the window and looked at him for the first time all evening as though he might be something other than furniture. The look lasted only a moment. Then she turned back. Tomorrow evening, she said. 8 o'clock. Don't be late this time. James nodded. He watched the lights of the city pass outside his window and thought about Noah, asleep at Mrs. Garner's apartment 2 floors below theirs, tucked into a borrowed couch with his shoes lined up neatly by the door because James had taught him that. Had taught him that you take care of your things, because your things are the things you have, and you are the things you take care of. 8 o'clock, he thought. I won't be late. He hadn't been late for anything in 7 years. Not since the morning Noah was born, and James had understood, looking at that small, red, furious face. That lateness was a luxury he could no longer afford. Some men are built by war, some by loss, some by love. James Calloway had been built by all 3 in that order, and what remained was something quieter and harder and more durable than anything Gerald Whitmore would ever understand across a Scotch glass in a room full of people applauding his cruelty. Something was moving in the dark around James Calloway. He didn't know it yet, but Noah would. The apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that the landlord described as charming, and that James described, internally, as honest. It was honest in the way that places are honest when they make no promises they can't keep. The radiator worked in the winter, most of the time. The hot water lasted about 7 minutes on a good morning. The window in the kitchen looked out onto a brick wall, but if you leaned slightly to the left and pressed your cheek almost against the glass, you could see a strip of sky above the rooftops. And on clear mornings, it was a shade of blue that cost nothing and belonged to nobody. Noah loved that window. He was 7 years old, with his father's quiet eyes and his mother's blonde hair, a combination that shouldn't have worked as well as it did, and yet somehow produced a face so earnest and so attentive that strangers on the subway sometimes did double takes. Not because he was particularly beautiful, though he was, but because of the quality of his attention. Noah Calloway looked at the world the way scientists look at things they find genuinely extraordinary. He didn't perform wonder. He felt it, visibly, in real time. And there was something about that in a child that made adults remember what they had lost. He was sitting at the kitchen table when James came home at 11:45, doing something he was not supposed to be doing, which was being awake. "You're supposed to be at Mrs. Garner's," James said, setting his keys on the counter. "Mrs. Garner fell asleep," Noah said, without looking up from the piece of paper he was drawing on. "I didn't want to wake her. I let myself in." James stood in the kitchen doorway in his rented tuxedo and looked at his son. There was a moment, there were always these moments, where the love he felt was so large and so without adequate expression that it almost looked like pain from the outside. "You ate?" he asked. "The leftover rice and an apple." "Good." He sat down at the table, still in the tuxedo because he was tired and because the chair was there. Noah finally looked up, examined his father with those precise, unrushed eyes. "You look sad," Noah said. "I'm tired." "You look both." James was quiet for a moment. He pulled at his collar, loosened the bow tie. Outside, a car passed on the street below. Somewhere in the building, a television was on. "I had a long night," he said. "The fancy people?" Noah asked. This was what they called it between them. The fancy people. Not with contempt exactly, but with the mild anthropological curiosity of 2 people who observe a culture from a permanent outside position. "Yeah, the fancy people." Noah considered this, returned to his drawing. "Were they mean to you?" James looked at his son, at the crown of that blonde head bent over the paper, at the careful way he held the pencil, the way James had taught him. "Not too tight, you don't need to fight it, just guide it." "Some of them," he said. "Did you get mad?" "No." Noah nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he already knew. "Because you never get mad," he said. Not as a criticism, as a fact. Something he had observed and catalogued and found, apparently, worth noting. "I get mad," James said. "I just don't always show it." Noah looked up again. "Is that hard?" "Sometimes." His son held his gaze for a long moment, One of those looks that children give you when they are processing something enormous with tools that are not quite big enough for it. And they know it, and they continue anyway. "I think you're really brave," Noah said. Then he looked back at his drawing, as simply as if he'd commented on the weather, and James sat in the kitchen of their honest apartment in his $48 rented tuxedo and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight all evening. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly on top of his son's head, the softest gesture he allowed himself, and then he stood up and went to put the kettle on. He had been doing this for 7 years. The doing of it had become its own kind of landscape, so constant, so thoroughly the shape of his life that he sometimes forgot it was hard. You stop noticing the weight when you have carried it long enough. You stop feeling the altitude when you have lived at it. The hard parts had fused over time into something that simply was: the early mornings, the packed lunches, the school forms, the parent-teacher meetings where he sat alone on one side of the table while the teacher looked at him with the practiced sympathy that single fathers receive, which is different from the sympathy single mothers receive, carrying in it a faint undercurrent of surprise, as though his presence there, engaged and prepared and asking the right questions, was slightly more than had been expected. He had never had a night off, not really, in 7 years. Even the evenings at the Harland estate or the Whitmore dinner or whatever gilded function Sophia required him to attend, those were not nights off. Those were nights working, just in a different costume. He didn't complain about this. Complaining required an audience and a belief that the audience could change something, and James Calloway had neither. What he had was Noah, and what he had quietly, privately, in the part of himself he showed no one, not the agency coordinator, not Mrs. Garner, not the men he worked beside at the loading dock who knew him as a man who did his share and minded his business, was the memory of who he had been before. Before Noah, before the loading dock, before the $48 tuxedos and the back-straight dignity and the year-round calculation of how to make a number that wasn't quite enough stretch into a number that was. He had been someone. Not in the way the Whitmores of the world were someone. Not with a name that opened rooms and money that bought silence, but in another way. A quieter way. A way that the men who had served beside him would recognize, and that the men who hadn't never would. He didn't think about it much. It was like a country he had emigrated from. You carry the passport, but you stop speaking the language daily. The muscles for it go soft. But sometimes, like tonight, standing in the geometric center of a room full of people who had looked through him, he felt it. Like a coal buried deep, still warm. He had been someone who did not flinch, and he still wasn't flinching. He was just doing it in a rented tuxedo now, for an audience that didn't know enough to understand what they were looking at. Sophia called at 7 the next morning. He was making Noah's breakfast: eggs, toast, the orange juice that came in the small cartons because the large ones went bad before they could finish them, when his phone rang. "There's an event Friday evening," she said, without preamble, without greeting. "Black tie, the Alderman Foundation Gala. It will run late. I'll need you there by 6:30. "I'll be there," he said. A pause, then, "You'll need a better suit." "The tuxedo is a rental, I can tell." Another pause. Shorter. "There's a shop on Whitfield. Tell them I sent you. They'll arrange it." He was quiet for a moment, processing the geography of what had just happened. She was offering to pay for it, or arrange for it, without saying so directly, in the way that people with money sometimes handle the money of others. Obliquely, in a manner that tries to preserve the dignity of the recipient, while making absolutely certain the recipient understands who has the power to offer and who has the need to receive. "I'll take care of the suit," he said. A longer pause this time. "Fine," Sophia said. And then, just before she ended the call, something that surprised him. Not a softness exactly, but a slight diminishment of the usual edge. "You did well last night, despite the Gerald situation." The call ended. James set the phone on the counter and slid the eggs onto Noah's plate. "Who was that?" Noah asked, climbing into his chair. "The woman I work for. The fancy lady? Yeah. Noah picked up his fork, considered his eggs with the seriousness he brought to all things. Is she nice? James thought about it. The honest apartment deserved an honest answer. She's complicated, he said. Noah nodded as though this were entirely satisfying. Complicated people are usually interesting, he said, and put a forkful of eggs in his mouth. James looked at his 7-year-old son. Something moved through him, not quite pride, not quite awe, something that lived between the two and had no clean name. Yeah, he said. I think you might be right about that. He sat down across from his son, and they ate breakfast together in the morning light that came in sideways through the kitchen window, catching the dust motes and turning them briefly gold, and the building around them was waking up. Pipes ticking, footsteps overhead, the distant sound of Mrs. Garner's morning program through the floor, and the world outside was already moving and demanding and indifferent, as it always was, but in here it was just the two of them. And for James Calloway, that had always been enough. What he didn't know yet was that Friday evening was going to change something, not immediately, not obviously, but in the way that a hairline fracture changes a wall, invisibly at first, and then, one morning, undeniably. Something was already moving. The Alderman Foundation Gala occupied 3 floors of the Meridian Grand Hotel, and the theme, according to the invitation Sophia had handed him in the car without comment, was legacy and vision. James had read those 2 words and thought about what they meant to him and what they meant to the people who would be inside. And the 2 answers were so different that they lived in separate countries. He arrived at 6:28. Sophia was already there, waiting in the hotel's private entrance with the composed impatience of someone who had decided years ago that waiting was a thing that happened to other people, and that when it happened to her, it was a logistical failure on someone else's part. She looked at him when he stepped out of the car. He had not gone to Whitfield Street. He had instead spent 3 hours at a dry cleaner on Garnet Avenue, whose owner, a Korean man named Mr. Sung, had worked a kind of quiet miracle on a suit James had owned for 9 years, the suit he had worn to his discharge ceremony, to 2 funerals, and once to a job interview for a position he didn't get. Mr. Sung had pressed it into something approaching authority. It was not a Whitfield Street suit, but it was his. Sophia looked at it, at him. Something passed through her eyes too quickly to name. You didn't go to Whitfield, she said. No. She studied him for a moment longer than was necessary. Then she turned toward the hotel entrance. Come, she said. The gala was everything James had come to understand these events to be. A form of theater in which everyone was simultaneously performer and audience, where the currency was not money exactly, but the display of money. The performance of consequence. A string quartet played something German in the corner. The canapés arrived on trays carried by young people who moved with the practiced invisibility of those who have learned to serve without being seen. James understood that invisibility. He had practiced his own version of it for years. The difference was that the servers were invisible by design, by professional requirement, by the unwritten contract of their presence. James was invisible because, to these people, a man who had come up from work, real work, physical work, the kind that leaves marks on your hands, simply did not register as a full participant in their world. You could put him in any suit, place him at any table, and he would remain, at a molecular level, outside. He had made his peace with this. Or rather, he had made a truce with it. Peace would have required forgetting what it cost. The man who caused the trouble that night was not Gerald Whitmore. Gerald had not been invited to this particular event, which was a mercy for everyone, including Gerald, who might have encountered something he couldn't metabolize. The man who caused the trouble was named Dorian Chase. Dorian Chase was 47 years old, thin in the way that expensive clothes and careful eating produce, with silver at his temples and eyes the color of shallow water. He was a venture capitalist of some renown, or at least renown within the circles in which he moved, which he appeared to believe were the only circles that mattered. He had been Sophia's associate for 3 years, which James learned from overhearing a conversation, Not from anything Sophia told him, because Sophia told him very little and appeared to consider this appropriate. Dorian noticed James approximately 30 minutes into the event. He materialized at Sophia's elbow with the ease of a man who had moved through rooms like this one for so long that the movement had become involuntary, like breathing. He kissed her on the cheek, assessed James without turning his head, the way predators assess things in their peripheral vision. Sophia. A smile. You've brought someone. James Calloway, Sophia said. He's accompanying me this evening. Dorian extended a hand. James took it. The handshake was the particular kind that wealthy men use to test other men. Harder than necessary. Held a half-second longer than comfortable, the grip saying, I am measuring you. James matched it exactly. Pressure for pressure, duration for duration, and released. Dorian's shallow eyes moved across him slowly. Calloway, he said. What is it that you do, James? Logistics, James said. He'd learned to say it without further elaboration. The less you offered men like this, the less they had to work with. Logistics. Dorian repeated it the same way Gerald had, with that particular intonation, that slight elongation, that turns a word into a quiet diminishment. Self-employed? I work for a company. Dorian turned back to Sophia with a smile that included James only, insofar as a painting on the wall is included in a conversation held in its presence. You know the Alderman Board is asking about the Prescott development again. I told them you'd have a position by month's end. What followed was a conversation that moved entirely around James, treating him as a fixed object in the landscape rather than a person. Dorian spoke to Sophia. Sophia spoke to Dorian. Sophia. James stood at the edge of their orbit and said nothing, because he had been hired to be present, not to participate, and he understood this, and it cost him something that he quietly paid. But then Dorian, in the middle of a sentence about projected returns, turned to James as an afterthought, the way you might turn to a decorative lamp and comment on the shade, and said, Tell me, James, does it ever get tedious, being decorative? The room did not stop. The quartet continued. The canapés continued to arrive on their invisible trays. The conversation around them did not pause or redirect. But within the immediate radius, there was a small stillness, the held breath of people who have scented the specific cruelty of a man who knows he can say what he just said without consequence. Sophia went very still beside him, a different kind of still from her usual composure. This was the stillness of someone who has heard something and has not yet decided what to do with it. James looked at Dorian Chase. He did not look away. He did not shift. He did not adjust his expression by a single degree. There is a thing that happens in men who have been in real danger, not social danger, not professional danger, not the danger of embarrassment or diminishment, but actual danger, the kind with physical weight and irreversible consequences. A thing that happens in those men when they are confronted with a person who believes that cruelty is power. Something settles. The way a structure settles when all its weight finds the ground. You become, in those moments, completely and unmovably yourself. No, James said, it doesn't. And then he said nothing else. Dorian blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, smiled again, but the smile had lost something, some confidence in its own welcome. And he turned back to Sophia and resumed his sentence, and the small stillness ended, and the evening continued. But Sophia was looking at James now. Not the way she had looked at him at the bottom of her staircase. Not the furniture assessment look. Something different. Something that arrived in her eyes, and then was quickly managed, controlled, filed away behind the composure she wore the way other people wear armor. He looked away first, not because he was discomfited, but because he understood that whatever she was processing deserved privacy. Later, much later, when the event had wound down and the quartet had packed away their instruments and the canapé trays had made their final rounds, they found themselves in a brief, accidental pocket of quiet near the hotel's large east windows, looking out at the city below. She spoke first. "You were a soldier," she said, not a question. He turned to look at her. "What makes you say that?" The way you stand. The way you absorb. She paused. The way you didn't give Dorian what he wanted. James said nothing. What branch? She asked. Marines. She absorbed this the way she absorbed most things, efficiently, without excess reaction. How long? 8 years. And then? He was quiet for a moment. The city lights below were cold and numerous, and utterly indifferent to the people looking at them. And then other things, he said. She nodded slowly, looked back at the window. He could see her reflection beside his in the dark glass, the blue dress, the careful posture, the face that was working very hard at something that had nothing to do with the gala. I have a son, she said suddenly, as though it had escaped rather than been offered. He glanced at her. He's 7, she said. The age landed in James's chest like a stone dropped in still water. So is mine, he said. Now she looked at him, fully, without management or filter or the sophisticated machinery of her usual self-presentation. Just a woman, briefly, looking at a man who had said something unexpected. I didn't know that, she said. You didn't ask. A silence. Then something that was almost a smile. Not the social performance kind she deployed at events like this one, but something smaller and more involuntary, something that happened to her face rather than being arranged by it. No, she said. I didn't. They stood at the window for another minute, maybe 2, while the city continued beneath them, and neither of them said anything else. And in that silence, something shifted, barely, almost imperceptibly, like a needle moving 1 degree on a compass, but shifted nonetheless. James would think about that window later. He would think about their reflections in it, his dark suit, her blue dress, the city spread behind them like a consequence. And he would understand that something had begun in that moment that he could not yet name. He didn't know about Noah yet. Her Noah. He didn't know what was coming. But the something was moving now. He could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. Not with your eyes, but with your skin. With the oldest parts of you. With the parts that have been paying attention for so long that they have learned to feel what isn't visible yet. Something was coming. And whatever it was going to change everything. It happened on a Thursday. Not a Friday, not a weekend, not one of the evenings that James had circled on the mental calendar he kept. The events, the galas, the dinners where he stood near Sophia Harland and absorbed the ambient contempt of people who had never carried anything heavier than their own sense of entitlement. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon when Sophia called and said, with the slight edge of someone asking something they're not entirely comfortable asking, "My regular sitter cancelled. I have a call with the Geneva office at 4. I need someone to watch Liam for 2 hours." A pause. I wouldn't ask if I had another option. James had been at the loading dock since 5 that morning. He had 4 hours left on his shift. He had arranged for Noah to go directly to Mrs. Garner's after school, the way he always did on dock days, and Mrs. Garner would feed him and help him with his reading, and James would be home by 7. He could say no. He had every reason to say no. "I'll be there by 4, he said. He arranged the last 2 hours of his shift with a co-worker named Tate, who owed him 4 favors and now owed him 5, changed out of his work clothes in the dock bathroom, and drove to the Harland estate in clothes that still carried the faint smell of freight and cold concrete. Sophia met him at the door. Behind her, half hidden in the shadow of the hallway, was a boy. He was 7 years old. James knew it instantly, the way parents know the age of other people's children, by some calibration of height and proportion and the particular quality of their stillness. He was blonde, like his mother, with eyes that were darker than hers. And he was wearing what appeared to be a small tuxedo, not a costume, an actual child's formal suit, black jacket, black trousers, small black shoes, which James would later learn was because Liam had attended a school recital that morning and had refused, on principle that he never fully articulated, to change out of it afterward. The boy looked at James. Not the way children usually look at strangers, with the reflexive assessment of threat or boredom or the preliminary calculation of whether this new adult is going to be interesting or useful. Liam looked at James the way his mother had looked at him through the window at the Meridian Grand. Directly, fully, without management. "You're the man from the parties," Liam said. "Liam," Sophia said. "That's what you call him," Liam said, unperturbed. "The man from the parties." He returned his attention to James. "She talks about you sometimes, when she thinks I'm asleep." Sophia's composure, which James had come to think of as structural, load-bearing, essential, flickered visibly for the first time he had witnessed. "Inside," she said to Liam. "Mr. Calloway is going to stay with you while I take my call. You will be polite, and you will not interrogate him." "I'm not interrogating," Liam said. "I'm observing." He turned and walked back into the house with the dignified unhurriedness of someone who has just said exactly what he meant to say and sees no reason to rush away from it. James looked at Sophia. She looked back at him with an expression that contained, in roughly equal measure, apology and something that might have been relief. She began. "He's great," James said, and meant it. He had not been inside the estate beyond the foyer before. It was the kind of house that reveals itself slowly, not through grandeur exactly, though there was grandeur, but through the accumulation of small details that spoke to a life ordered entirely by one person's taste. The furniture was precise without being cold. The art on the walls was chosen rather than purchased. There were books on the shelves that had been read, their spines creased at real intervals, not arranged for appearance. And then there was Liam's corner. It occupied the far end of the main sitting room, a small geography of childhood that existed in almost comic contrast to the rest of the house's composed elegance. Drawings tacked to a corkboard, a low shelf of books with titles that ranged from picture books to a worn copy of a children's encyclopedia that had clearly been consulted so many times the cover had separated from the spine. A wooden box of colored pencils, each one worn to a different length, suggesting a passionate and unequal relationship with certain colors. On the floor, a half-finished puzzle of the solar system. Liam stood in the center of this corner and watched James take it in. "I like Saturn the best," he said, nodding at the puzzle. "But Pluto is my favorite." "Pluto's not a planet anymore," James said. "I know," Liam said, with a gravity that belonged on a much older face. "That's why it's my favorite. Being what you are even when people decide you're not counts for something." James stood very still for a moment. He looked at this 7-year-old boy in his small black tuxedo, crouched over a puzzle of the solar system in the corner of a mansion, saying things that most adults would not have the clarity or the courage to say. "Yeah," James said quietly. "It does." Liam sat down cross-legged on the floor next to the puzzle. "You can sit if you want," he said. "The floor's clean. Maria mops it every Tuesday." James sat on the floor. They worked on the puzzle together for 20 minutes without speaking much. And in those 20 minutes, James discovered that Liam Harland was one of those rare people, rare at any age, almost impossible at 7, who are genuinely comfortable with silence. He didn't fill it with noise or performance, or the anxious self-presentation that most people reach for when quiet arrives. He simply existed in it, his small hands moving pieces with a focus that was entirely his own. "Do you have a kid?" Liam asked eventually, fitting Neptune into its orbit. "I do. A son. His name is Noah." Liam looked up. "How old?" 7. Liam considered this with great seriousness. "Does he like puzzles?" "He likes drawing." "And asking questions." "I ask a lot of questions too," Liam said. "Mom says I ask more questions than she has answers for." He paused. "I think that means I'm asking the right ones." James looked at this child, at the fine, careful architecture of a mind that was working constantly, processing everything, making connections that most adults would miss entirely. "I think so too," he said. Sophia's call ran long. 2 hours became 3. James texted Mrs. Garner, who texted back a string of reassurances and a photograph of Noah eating soup. and he returned to the sitting room floor and the solar system puzzle and the company of a boy who seemed to understand. Without being told that the man sitting cross-legged on his floor was not precisely what the world had filed him under. At some point, the puzzle was finished. At some other point, Liam retrieved a book, the children's encyclopedia, the one with the separated cover, and read aloud to James from the section on deep-sea creatures. Not because he'd been asked to, but apparently because he found the subject urgent enough to share. James listened. He had always been a good listener. It was one of the things the Marines had refined in him, the understanding that information arrives from unexpected sources, and that the man who dismisses a source because it doesn't look important enough will eventually miss something he cannot afford to miss. He did not miss anything, Liam said. And Liam, he noticed, did not miss anything either. When Sophia finally appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, she stopped. James was on the floor, his back against the sofa, his long legs stretched out beside the completed solar system. Liam was beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, the encyclopedia open across both their laps, Liam reading and James listening with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Sophia stood in the doorway and looked at this. Something happened to her face. It was brief, a few seconds at most. The kind of thing you would miss if you weren't watching carefully, or if you hadn't spent weeks learning to read the controlled landscape of her expressions. But James wasn't watching. He was listening to Liam explain the bioluminescence of the anglerfish, and Liam wasn't watching either. He was talking. Only Sophia saw it. Only she knew what it was. She had not seen her son sit that close to a man since. She stopped the thought before it finished. Since a time she did not revisit in the presence of others, or in her own presence if she could help it. "Liam," she said. Her voice was entirely steady. "Time for dinner." Liam closed the encyclopedia carefully, looked up at James. "You should bring Noah sometime," he said. "I have 2 copies of the deep sea book. He could keep one." "I'll tell him," James said. He stood, looked at Sophia. Her expression was the usual one again, composed, precise, the sophisticated machinery back in place. But something behind it was different, some temperature. "Thank you," she said, "for staying." "No problem," he said. He meant it. That was the thing. He genuinely meant it. On the drive home, in the dark, with the city moving past his windows, James thought about Liam's voice, reading about creatures that make their own light in places where no light should exist. Being what you are even when people decide you're not counts for something. He thought about that for a long time. 3 weeks later, Sophia made a mistake. She would not have called it that, not initially. She would have called it a practical decision, a logical extension of an arrangement that had been functioning efficiently. She would have marshaled the same cool intelligence she brought to everything and produced a reasonable explanation for why she had done it. But it was a mistake, and somewhere beneath the composed surface of Sophia Harland, she knew it the moment it happened. She invited Noah, not officially, not with intention. It happened the way things sometimes happen between people who have been orbiting each other long enough that the distance between their separate lives begins to collapse by degrees. Liam had mentioned Noah 11 times in 3 weeks. James had counted privately, with the involuntary precision of a man who notices things. And on a Saturday morning, when Sophia had called to discuss a change to the following week's event schedule, Liam had appeared at her elbow and asked, loudly enough to be heard through the phone, whether Noah was coming today. A silence. "Is he available?" Sophia asked. Her voice carried a studied neutrality that James had learned to recognize as effort. He looked across his kitchen at Noah, who was eating cereal and reading the back of the cereal box with the dedicated attention he brought to all printed material. "Noah," James said. His son looked up. "You want to go visit a kid named Liam today. He's got a book about deep-sea creatures he wants to give you." Noah put down his spoon. "Does he like Saturn?" "He does, but his favorite is Pluto." Noah considered this for approximately 3 seconds. "Okay," he said, and picked up his spoon again. They arrived at the Harland estate at 11 in the morning, and the meeting of Liam and Noah was one of those things that James would carry with him for the rest of his life. Not because it was dramatic, but because of how utterly, completely, immediately right it was. The two boys looked at each other in the foyer for a moment, with the frank assessment of children who have not yet learned to perform interests they don't feel. And then Liam said, "Do you know how deep the Mariana Trench is?" And Noah said, 36,000 feet, roughly. And something in Liam's face opened like a door, and they walked together into the sitting room without another word, already moving in the direction of the bookshelf, already in the middle of a conversation that had apparently been waiting for them to find each other. James stood in the foyer. Sophia stood beside him. They both watched the boys disappear around the corner. 36,000 feet, Sophia said quietly. "He reads a lot," James said. "So does Liam." Another silence. Not the careful, managed silence of their early evenings together, the silences of two people maintaining professional distance, but something looser, something that had less architecture to it. "Coffee?" Sophia said. It was the first time she had offered him anything in the estate that wasn't a logistical instruction. "Sure," James said. They sat at the kitchen table, not the formal dining room, not the sitting room with its careful furniture, but the kitchen, where the light came in through a large window over the sink, and the counter had a small imperfection near the edge, where something had been set down too hard, years ago, and left a mark. James noticed the mark. It made the kitchen feel true. Sophia poured coffee, sat across from him, wrapped both hands around her mug. For a while they said nothing, and from somewhere deep in the house came the sound of two boys talking about the ocean floor, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of people who have found, unexpectedly, someone who speaks their particular language. "He's been different since Thursday," Sophia said eventually. James waited. "Liam." She looked at her coffee. "He's been different, lighter." A pause. "He doesn't always—" She stopped, started again. "He keeps his own company a lot. By choice. Mostly. Other children his age exhaust him, I think. He processes too fast, and they process too slowly, and the gap frustrates him." She paused again. "He doesn't usually invite people." "He invited Noah before he'd ever met him," James said. "I know." She looked up. "That's what I mean." James held his mug. The kitchen was warm. Outside the window over the sink, the Harland grounds extended. Carefully maintained, expensive, and somehow from this angle, simply green. "He reminds me of someone," James said. "Noah?" "No. Liam." He was quiet for a moment. "He reminds me of a kid I knew a long time ago. When I was deployed, we'd been assigned a local interpreter, 19 years old, barely. But he had that same thing, that same quality of seeing things other people walked past." Sophia was watching him carefully now. "What happened to him?" she asked. James looked at his coffee. "He didn't make it home." A silence, heavier than the others. "I'm sorry," Sophia said. "His name was Khalid." James said it simply, the way you say the names of people you carry, not with performance, not with the theatrical weight of grief, but with the plain, durable weight of someone who has been carried for a long time. "He was the reason I stayed for the second tour. I wanted to finish what we started together." Sophia did not say anything. She was the kind of person, James was learning, who understood when a silence was more respectful than a response. "I've never told anyone that," he said. He wasn't sure why he'd said it now. Maybe the kitchen. Maybe the imperfection in the counter. Maybe the sound of Noah's voice coming from somewhere in the house, talking about something that delighted him, in a place James hadn't expected his son to ever be. "Why are you telling me?" Sophia asked. Not unkindly. He thought about it. "Because you didn't ask me to," he said. She absorbed this. She looked back at her coffee, then back at him. And on her face, for the length of time it takes to breathe in and breathe out, was something he had not seen there before. Not the composure, not the sharpness, not the sophisticated social machinery. Just a woman, sitting across a kitchen table from a man who had said something true. "I lost someone too," she said. "Not to war." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. He understood, from the quality of her stillness, that the shape of what she had lost was the shape that absences make when they are the size of a person who was supposed to be there permanently. He nodded. The coffee cooled in their mugs. The boys' voices continued from deep in the house. It was 3 weeks after that morning that the evening happened. The evening that James had been hired for, another Harland estate dinner, smaller than the galas, a private affair for 12 people in the formal dining room, and Dorian Chase was there again. James had come to think of Dorian as a kind of recurring test. The universe presenting the same examination in slightly different rooms to see whether James's answer had changed. It had not. It would not. But on this particular evening, Dorian had apparently decided that the subtle approach had been insufficient. He waited until dinner was ending, until the wine had made its third round, until the conversation had reached that particular pitch of looseness that expensive dinners reach in their final hour, when the performance relaxes and what's underneath begins to show. He stood up with his wine glass and said, with the practiced ease of a man who knows he controls the room, "A toast to Sophia, who continues to surround herself with—" A pause, theatrical, with his eyes moving briefly to James in a way that made certain everyone knew where they were landing. Interesting company. Laughter. The comfortable kind. The kind that doesn't cost anything. James looked at Dorian across the table. And then something happened that James had not planned for. From the doorway of the dining room, where he had absolutely no business being, where he had been sent to bed an hour ago, where he had apparently not gone, Liam appeared. In his small black tuxedo, his shoes polished, his face carrying that particular expression of his that meant he had been listening and processing and had arrived at a conclusion. He walked to James's chair. He stood beside it, and then he put his small hand on the armrest next to James's arm and looked at Dorian Chase across the table with an expression of such clear, unafraid, uncomplicated certainty that the room went quiet in a different way than Dorian had intended. "Mr. Calloway," Liam said, in a voice that carried perfectly, "is the best person at this table." No one spoke. "He knows about Pluto," Liam continued, as though this were obvious and relevant and final. "And he listens. And he doesn't make people feel small." He looked at Dorian when he said the last part. Then he turned to James. And in a voice that was slightly quieter, not private, just personal, he said, "Do you want to be my dad?" The dining room of the Harland estate held 12 people, and the accumulated silence of something that had just been said that could never be unsaid. James Calloway felt the words enter him like light entering a room that has been closed for a long time. He looked at this boy, this 7-year-old boy in his small black tuxedo, who had calculated the depth of the Mariana Trench and knew about Pluto and understood, with a precision that no one at this table could match, exactly what he was saying and why. He looked at Sophia. She was very still, her hands flat on the table, her face doing something extraordinary. Not the composure, not the management, not the machinery. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been underneath it for a long time and had just, in the space of 4 words from a 7-year-old boy, broken the surface. Her eyes were bright. James looked back at Liam. "Come here," he said quietly. Liam stepped forward. James put his hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and warm and sure. "You're a remarkable kid," James said. "You know that?" Liam studied him. "That's not an answer." "No," James said. "It's not." He looked up again. At Sophia, at her hands on the table, at the brightness in her eyes that she was working hard to contain. "It's a beginning," he said. "Some things end loudly. Some things end with spectacle, with confrontation and revelation and the clean. Cinematic satisfaction of a moment that resolves everything at once. Those are the endings that get told and retold, that become the story a family passes down, the thing a man describes to his son when his son is old enough to ask how things began. But some things, the truest things, the ones that actually hold, end quietly. Or rather, they don't end at all. They become something else. They become the floor beneath everything. What happened after that night in the dining room of the Harland estate was not a single moment. It was a series of small, undramatic, irreversible decisions made by two people who had spent long enough alone to have forgotten that there was another way, and then been reminded. By two 7-year-old boys who had never learned to forget it, because they had never needed to. Dorian Chase left the dinner early. He made his excuses with the social fluency of a man who knows when a room has shifted against him, and he left. And the remaining guests, with the adaptability that people develop when they have attended enough of these evenings to understand that the drama is never where you expect it, rearranged themselves and continued the evening without him. Sophia walked Liam back to his room herself. James waited in the hallway outside. He heard her voice through the door, low even, the tone she used with Liam that was different from every other tone she had, softer at the edges without losing its essential structure. He heard Liam's voice answering. He couldn't make out the words. He didn't try. When she came out, she left the door slightly open behind her, the way parents leave doors in case. She stood in the hallway and looked at James for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. He shook his head slightly. "I do," she said. The way this was structured. The arrangement. I treated you like—" She paused. The words, he could see, were difficult for her in the way that honest words are difficult for people who have been in control for a very long time. "I treated you like a prop. And you are not a prop." And I knew that fairly early on, and I continued anyway, because it was easier. "Easier than what?" he asked. She held his gaze. And in it was the answer she wasn't saying. Easier than this. Easier than standing in a hallway at 11 in the evening acknowledging that a man I hired to stand beside me has become something I don't have a category for. "I don't do this well," she said. "This." A small gesture, encompassing the hallway, the slightly open door, the space between them. "I built a very specific life. After." She didn't say after what. She didn't need to. And it works. It functions. Liam is cared for and I am capable and everything operates. "But," James said. She looked at him. Something in her eyes was undisguised for once. "Liam asked you if you wanted to be his father," she said, in front of 12 people, including Dorian Chase. She paused. "He has never, in 7 years, said anything like that to anyone." James was quiet. "He doesn't make mistakes about people," she said. "He's been making assessments since he could talk, and he's never wrong. I've watched him be not wrong about people for 7 years. Her voice, for the first time, carried something that sounded like the edge of a feeling she hadn't chosen. "He's not wrong about you." James looked at this woman in the hallway of her enormous, carefully ordered house, at the blue dress she still wore, at the heels she had not yet taken off, at the composed, precise, formidable person she was, and at the thing underneath that composure that was looking at him right now from her eyes. "I have a son," he said. "He's 7. He reads everything he can get his hands on, and he draws, and he likes asking questions, and he eats cereal for dinner when I'm not paying attention." A pause. "He's the best thing I've ever done." "I know," she said. "I've heard Liam talk about him for 3 weeks. I work the loading dock 4 days a week," James continued. "I drive for a car service 2 nights. I live in a 4th-floor apartment with honest problems, and a view of a strip of sky if you lean at the right angle." He looked at her steadily. "I don't have what you have. I'm not what the people in your world have decided a man worth considering looks like." "I know what you are," Sophia said, and the quiet certainty in it stopped him. "What's that?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost all its managed edges. "A man who raised a child alone without losing himself, who stood in rooms full of people who tried to diminish him and never once let them, who sat on my son's floor and listened to him read about anglerfish for an hour and a half like it was the most important thing happening in the world." She looked at him. "That's what you are, James," he told Noah that weekend. Not everything. Noah was 7, and 7 has its own pace and its own capacity, and James had spent 7 years learning to meet his son at that capacity rather than exceeding it. But he told him that he liked Sophia, and that he liked Liam, and that he thought they might be spending more time with them. Noah received this information the way he received most information, with the quiet, concentrated stillness of someone running it through an internal process that was more sophisticated than its container suggested. Then he said, "Liam told me his mom is sad sometimes." "People who have lost things are sometimes sad," James said. "You lost things," Noah said. "Are you sad?" James considered the question with the respect it deserved. "Sometimes," he said. "Less than I used to be." Noah looked at him. "Because of me?" "Mostly because of you." His son nodded, went back to his drawing. Then, without looking up, "I think Liam needs a brother." James looked at the crown of his son's blonde head, at the pencil moving in careful lines across the paper, at the 7 years of mornings and evenings and hard days and good ones that had produced this person, this small, earnest, extraordinary person who said things like, "Being what you are, even when people decide you're not counts for something, and Pluto is my favorite, and I think Liam needs a brother," and felt something happen in his chest that he did not try to name because naming it would have made it smaller than it was. He put his hand briefly on top of Noah's head. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe he does." Dorian Chase made one more attempt. It was at a foundation event 6 weeks later, the kind of event James no longer attended as hired company, but as Sophia's guest, a distinction that she had made quietly, and he had accepted quietly, and that the people around them had noticed in the way that people in those circles always notice the shift in a powerful woman's gravity. Dorian arrived with the fixed smile of a man who has rehearsed. He shook hands. He made his social rounds. And then he came to James, deliberately, in front of a cluster of people who included 3 members of the Foundation's board. "Still here," Dorian said, with a smile. "Still here," James agreed. "I heard about the dinner." The smile narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Charming moment. A child asking you to be his father." A pause, calculated. "Children say all sorts of things." James looked at him. He thought about the loading dock in the cold morning, about the honest apartment on the 4th floor, about $48 tuxedos and 7 years of decisions filtered through a single question. What does this mean for Noah? About Khalid, who had been 19 and brilliant and had not made it home. About 2 boys on a sitting room floor completing a solar system puzzle, their shoulders nearly touching, already brothers in some way that predated the word. He thought about Sophia in the hallway. "That's what you are, James." He thought about all of it, and he felt it, the coal, buried deep, still warm, the thing that had not been extinguished by any of it. The thing that Gerald Whitmore and Dorian Chase and every person who had ever looked at his hands and made their calculation had failed. Completely, to touch. "They do," James said pleasantly. "And sometimes what they say is exactly right." He looked at Dorian Chase with the calm of a man who has been to places where the stakes were real and has therefore lost all fear of the decorative versions. "Have a good evening," he said, and he walked away. The night that James Calloway understood that his life had fundamentally changed was not dramatic. There was no announcement, no grand gesture, no moment with music and light arranged behind it. It was a Sunday, late October. The window in Sophia's kitchen was gold with afternoon light, and the boys were in the sitting room doing something that involved the solar system puzzle, and what sounded like an elaborate argument about whether a hypothetical planet beyond Pluto would have moons. And Sophia was at the counter, making tea with the quiet efficiency she brought to everything, and James was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around a coffee mug, watching the light move across the floor. Sophia set a cup in front of him. She didn't say anything. She sat across from him, wrapped her hands around her own cup. From the sitting room, it would definitely have moons. How many? At least 4. Why 4? Because 4 feels right. That's not science. It's an estimate. Estimates are science. Sophia was looking at him. He was looking at her. The light moved. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" She thought about it. Then, "For not being what I expected, and for being exactly what was needed." James held his coffee, looked at the light, looked at her. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons do, burning itself out slowly, beautifully, in shades of amber and copper, and the particular gold that belongs only to that season, that slant, that hour. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She held his gaze. And what was in her eyes, finally, without management, without machinery, without the armor she had worn for so long she had half forgotten it was armor, was simply this. A woman who had been alone, and was less alone now, and knew it, and was not afraid of knowing it. "I know," she said, and that was enough. That was, in the way of true things, more than enough. In the sitting room, two boys who had decided they were brothers argued happily about the moons of a planet that didn't exist. And outside the kitchen window, October was burning itself gold, and inside there was coffee and light, and two people sitting across a table from each other, in the particular silence of people who have stopped performing and simply arrived. James Calloway had carried everything alone for a long time. He was still strong enough to carry it. He would always be strong enough. But the door was open now, and the light was coming in.